Good morning, all. Now is a great time to be planting cool season cover crops in many areas of the country. Today in my Ohio garden, I'm getting ready to spot plant some areas with winter rye. Now, winter rye, also known as cereal rye, is one of my favorite cool season cover crops. It is awesome for improving my clay soil and offers a myriad of other benefits. Now, I think rye is a cover crop that some home gardeners have been hesitant to try, mainly because the termination requirements are a smidge trickier than they are with other cover crops. But as I'm hoping to share in today's video, the many benefits that rye can offer are well worth a little bit of extra effort on the termination end. And to make up for that, it's one of the easiest, most cold-hardy cover crops to grow. While winter rye is often seen used in large-scale settings, often in a monoculture type setup, say with corn or soybeans, it might actually offer more benefits to the home gardener. But before I get into detail with all of those benefits, let me take a quick minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, Lomi. Planting winter rye and other cover crops is one way that I work toward improving my soil health in the garden. But I also focus on the addition of all types of organic matter to boost my soil. Now, I'm not big on having yet another appliance sitting around my house, but I have happily made the exception for Lomi. Lomi is a revolutionary new appliance that converts my family's food waste into rich organic matter that can then be added back into my garden beds to improve my harvests. Instead of keeping my stinky, disgusting compost bucket, a bucket where we used to put all of our food waste and scraps, under the sink, I can put all of that waste directly into the Lomi, reducing waste by 50 to 80%, and thanks to Lomi's filtering system, reducing 99% of that stanky food waste odor. I'm going to run my Lomi on Eco Express mode right now. This is the quickest Lomi mode and can break down food waste and scraps in 3 to 5 hours. So let's pop all the food waste in here. I've got eggshells, coffee grounds, fruit and veggie scraps, and check back on this in a bit. And we're back. Check this out. I'm going to be tossing all of this goodness onto my garden beds as I clean them out and put them to rest for the fall, for a nice little boost come spring planting time. If you are interested in trying out Lomi, click on the link in the video description below. And now, back to the benefits of rye. One of my favorite things about rye are its weed-fighting abilities. Rye has allelopathic tendencies. Allelopathy being an ecological phenomenon wherein a plant produces and releases chemicals that inhibit the germination and or growth of surrounding plants. And in rye in particular, these allelopathic tendencies can discourage certain garden weeds. From the SARE, Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education website, rye is one of the best cool season cover crops for outcompeting weeds, especially small-seeded, light-sensitive annuals such as lamb's quarters, red root pigweed, which is a big problem for me, velvet leaf, chickweed, and foxtail. Rye also suppresses many weeds allelopathically, including dandelions and Canadian thistles, and has been shown to inhibit germination of some trazine-resistant weeds. I don't know about you guys, but I can use all the natural weed fighting power in my garden that I can get, so I'm happy to have rye on my side. And as mentioned by that SARE article, rye fights weeds not only allelopathically, but also by just out competition and suppression. So rye grows so quickly that it is outgrowing many of the surrounding weeds and basically blocking them out from any light or nutrition. Rye is also an excellent soil builder and improver. It is a source of ample biomass, just meaning that it puts on a lot of green growth, which, when terminated and allowed to rot down into the soil, provides plentiful organic matter. It can also help loosen clay soil, and this is by virtue of this very massive fibrous root system that rye has. Rye pushes those roots down in and through heavy soils, improving drainage and aeration. Additionally, rye outperforms all other cover crops on particularly poor soils. So infertile soils, sandy soils, acid soils, basically anywhere where you have a highly problematic soil where things don't like to grow, chances are rye will grow. It also helps to prevent topsoil erosion, which can be a problem when soil is left bare, particularly in the late winter going into the early spring, when heavy precipitation tends to cause topsoil erosion via runoff. Rye also functions as a nutrient catch crop. Now, this is a little bit different than a nitrogen fixer like a leguminous cover crop. Again, according to SARE, rye is the best cool season cereal cover crop for absorbing unused soil nitrogen. It has no taproot, but rye's quick-growing fibrous root system can take up and hold as much as 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre until the spring. Be aware, though, that rye actually ties up nitrogen as it breaks down. It's scavenged nitrogen not being immediately available to subsequent crops. The general advice is to wait at least 2 weeks after terminating your rye prior to planting your following crop. A couple of additional tweaks include terminating rye at an immature stage, so 18 inches or less, because that tender young growth will tie up less nitrogen as it breaks down than old, mature, woody growth. Additionally, you can combine your rye with a legume cover crop. Hairy vetch is a great choice because it is also winter hardy, and the legume will offset some of that nitrogen tie-up in the rye. I'll talk a little more in detail about this later in the video, but I will say I use the method of just waiting a couple weeks prior to planting corn, and saw absolutely no issues with nitrogen tie-up in my own garden. And a couple of other additional benefits, because rye is taller and faster growing than things like wheat or oats, it can actually be used as a wind/snow break in the winter months. Rye can attract beneficial insects, including lady beetles, as well as reducing populations of parasitic root knot nematodes. And while it's not a benefit per se, it's actually really nice to be able to look out into the garden in the dreary, gray, brown, late winter, very early spring, and actually see something lush and green growing. Now, planting winter rye is pretty darn easy. As I mentioned, it's a cool season cover crop, and it's the hardiest of all cereal grains, able to be planted later in the fall than any other cover crops. In fact, it can germinate in soil temperatures as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, here in Ohio and in much of the Midwest, the best time to plant rye is anytime during the month of September. You want to allow it to get established, but you don't want to let it put on too much green growth before the really freezing temperatures set in. Obviously, in planting areas further to the north or further to the south, you need to tweak that planting time a little bit. And usually, if you're unsure about planting times, you can give your local extension agency a call, and they should be able to give you advice about the best time to plant winter rye cover crop. Now, big scale farmers often drill seed rye, but for the home gardener, I find it's easiest just to broadcast sow. Broadcast sowing rates vary a little. Johnny's recommends a sowing rate of 4 to 6 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Texas A&M recommends 3/4 to 1 pound per 100 square feet. Honestly, in my own garden, when I broadcast sow, I'm not measuring anything. Rye is very forgiving of overseeding, so I just kind of get out there and scatter sow an amount that looks good to me, and I've always had success with it. So to actually prep for planting, I'll typically go out and very lightly fork up my soil. This step probably isn't even necessary, as rye can actually be interseeded or oversown into existing plantings. I kind of just do it more out of habit than anything, but then I will broadcast sow and very lightly rake that seed into the soil. As I mentioned, with this timing, that will allow the seed to germinate, get a small amount of growth before the frigid winter temperatures really set in, and then it just kind of lays dormant until the very early spring, where it will take off on growth again. Now, termination. It's the one tricky part about winter rye, and it's not even that bad, I promise. The key to terminating or killing off rye is just getting it at the right time so that you don't get regrowth. Rye can be very persistent and it can turn into pretty much a weed if you let it. But I've been using rye for years and have never had issues with it. So you have a couple options when it comes to termination timing. The first is to terminate very early in the spring when the rye is only about 12 to 18 inches tall. As I mentioned earlier, terminating at this immature size will help to lessen nitrogen tie-up during breakdown. If you till, an easy way to terminate is just to go in at this time of year, till all that rye under. In my garden, I come in and just chop it all down with my weed whacker and then use a fork or a rototiller to gently incorporate it into the soil. Now, if you let it grow taller and a little bit later in the season, you will definitely have issues with regrowth. I will say the first year that I grew it, I waited till it was probably about 24 inches tall, did this process, and I did have it regrowing in spots all over the garden. I didn't find this to be particularly problematic. I just kind of pulled up the individual plants as they popped up, and I didn't have any further issues with it. The second option is waiting until late spring, early summer, when 100% of the plants are shedding or have shed pollen, or in other words, are at anthesis. Terminating prior to anthesis at this time of year can result in a lot of grow back of the plants. Now, termination style can vary depending on what tools you have and what scale you're working on. On a larger scale, you'll often hear of folks rolling and crimping their rye. Now, I don't have the space or the budget for a crimper roller. You can make one supposedly by constructing a board hooked to ropes where you just by hand rock that board over your rye to crimp the stems. I have not tried this personally, but have heard that it works well. Another option is to let an overly energetic small child run repeatedly over the top of your rye cover crop until it is dead. I actually had 100% effectiveness with this method. And finally, what I end up doing most often is, again, just coming in where the plants are at that stage, cutting them off, and I like to do this in about thirds. So I'll take a swipe off the top third, take a swipe off the bottom third, then cut at ground level with my weed whacker, cutting down that whole crop, and then just allowing all of that residue to sit and rot on top of the soil. Conveniently, it also acts as a mulch and weed suppressant when done in this style. You could, of course, also till that or incorporate that into the ground. I just find leaving it lay is much, much easier for me. Now, as a side note, back to that allelopathic tendency that rye has, there are some growers, again, particularly larger scale growers that are going in with corn after a rye cover crop that have had concerns that the rye will affect the growth of their corn. Research suggests that rye does not have much of an effect on corn due to the size of the seed and the depth of the planting. But for anyone who is concerned, again, just wait at least 2 weeks prior to planting after terminating your rye. And the same could be said for any garden crop that you are growing. Now, I wanted to share with you the progress I've made in this particular corner of the garden with the help of rye cover cropping. This whole back corner was always a problem area for me. It's a little bit lower lying, it had very poor drainage, and horrendous weed issues that I just could not get under control. So last summer, I fenced up some of my chickens in this area. And when I moved them out, I planted winter rye. On May 17th, I chopped all of my rye, and as I mentioned, I just let it lay on the soil surface as a mulch. And on June 4th, I came in and planted sweet corn. The corn progressed beautifully, and recently I was able to come in and pick and had an excellent harvest off of this plot. The soil fertility, the weed populations, and the drainage all have improved vastly in this little corner of the garden. So I am really happy with this experience using winter rye. So I will say, if you are interested in experiencing the garden-changing magic of rye cover crop, get out and get planting today. And if you're already a fan of rye, drop a line in the comments below and tell me about it. Tell me how you use it in your own garden. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.